Shrouded in mystery, the Scadutree looms high above the land of shadow. Little is officially stated by in-game text about its nature, aside from the ambiguous phrase, "The Scadutree is the shadow of the Erdtree." Since there is so little spoken about the Scadutree, I have seen many interpretations derived from environmental and context clues about what it is, when it came about, and what its purpose is within the land of shadow. Many of these seem reasonable. Many are rife with contradictions, so I want to set the record straight, or at least provide my own theory, on the Scadutree and its relation to the Erdtree, the history of the lands between, and of course, the Primordial Crucible. It is my belief, based on the facts that are about to follow, that the Scadutree is the Erdtree. Now, there's a lot to cover here, but before we dive in, let me illustrate what I mean. The Scadutree has two trunks. This linear one is the trunk of the original Erdtree. The second trunk, which coils around the first, that is a sealing tree of the same stock as the sealing tree that enshrouds Inir Illim. Together, they make the Scadutree. Well, so then what is the golden tree that towers above the lands between? Well, that would be an idealized, spiritual manifestation of the Erdtree. You could say the persona of the Erdtree, one part of a tree that was divided in two. I'm refraining from using the term illusory since that implies that it's not real. It is very much real. It's just not the entire Erdtree. When in Leyndell, the Erdtree appears solid all the way through. And when approaching the Elden throne, we find that the portion of it that we can actually interact with is made of wood. But when viewed from a certain distance, the trunk of the Erdtree becomes transparent. I thought this was universally accepted, but I once started a debate for pointing this out, with some individuals claiming that this was just developer oversight, since I guess there's a location in Caelid where you can trigger the Erdtree into toggling between its transparent and solid state. I can concede that the lack of a smooth transition is an oversight, but the transparency itself is 100% intentional. Look at the map. Its base is transparent on the hand-drawn map of the same section of the trunk that is transparent in the overworld. So what? They just forgot to add the correct shaders to the most prominent and eye-catching object of the game, the central focus of our adventure and the overall narrative, and then they included this mistake when drawing the map? Shame, shame from software, your laziness betrays you. No, this tells us that canonically, the closer you are to the Erdtree, the more solid it appears. So what of the corporeal portion? Well, that's all that remains of the original Erdtree, the stump. I'm not going to bog down this video debating this, but if you still insist that the Erdtree is not spiritual or illusory, stop the video now and check out my pinned comment below for more evidence. This was all relevant, and we'll come back to it later. I would be remiss for not mentioning the first burning of the Erdtree, since that is the most popular explanation for the Erdtree being in its spectral state. This theory, accepted by many as canon, was first put forward by tarnished archaeologists, and they created a very compelling argument that this happened. They postulate that this happened during the Shattering, which, if true, is pretty likely. Though, to be honest, I'm not completely sold on the idea. In any case, the shift from the Erdtree bestowing blessings to the Erdtree being an object of faith happened before the Shattering, from my interpretation, and so that's why I do not subscribe to the idea that this burning is what made the Erdtree spectral. After all, we can burn the Erdtree just fine. Well, anyways, let's get back to the topic at hand. During Godfrey's reign, blessed golden sap would drip endlessly from the boughs of the Erdtree, but this age quickly came to a close and the Erdtree became an object of faith. This is reflected in the change in the incantation seals that represent the Erdtree, moving from the chaotic depiction of the ancient Erdtree incantations to the more refined, symbolic design of the standard Erdtree seal. This time period neatly aligns with the most likely range for when the Land of Shadow was veiled, after Godfrey's banishment, but before Radagon's betrayal of Renala, since her sister Relana took part in the crusade. And wouldn't you know, the linear trunk of the Scadutree bleeds golden sap in abundance. In her eloquent video, the Erdtree is a tree of memories. Nameless Singer postulates that runes are memories and that the Erdtree is the summation of all memories in the lands between. This is why remembrances are hewn into the Erdtree. Well, it follows that the Scadutree is also a tree of memories, as we can find shadow runes and remembrances from the Land of Shadow are hewn into the Scadutree. And lastly, we have the avatars. I still see people referring to an avatar as a guardian, creation, or individual entity. An avatar is literally the entity it refers to. It is a Sanskrit word meaning descent, as in descending to earth. Jesus is an avatar of Yahweh, because he is literally God made flesh. The numerous avatars of Vishnu are literally Vishnu walking the earth. Marika is the latest avatar of the Greater Will, literally the Greater Will come down to the lands between itself, at least according to my interpretation. And the Scadutree avatar and the Erdtree avatars are the trees themselves. When preparing for its nuclear laser blast attack, the Scadutree avatar strikes a pose identical to the twisting trunk of the Scadutree, and its body is composed of two intertwining stems. Well, what form does the Erdtree avatar take? Why, a tree stump, of course. So, if you're still with me, the next logical question would be, why was a part of the Erdtree hidden away? Well, to banish the Primordial Crucible. As you likely already know, the Crucible of Life, also called the Primordial Crucible, is the original form of the Erdtree. Marika and her people were subjugated by a culture who venerated the Primordial Crucible. When she became a god, she channeled the power of this energy and created the Erdtree, establishing a new order for the world where the chaotic crucible was channeled into a more orderly and contained form. But the crucible would not be restrained so easily. By the time Godfrey and the Tarnished were banished, the curse of the Omen had already progressed far enough that it affected Marika's own progeny. Hundreds of horned children and crucible-touched creatures like the Misbegotten were springing up all across the Golden Empire. The pot was boiling over. With the Erdtree's greatest enemies defeated and the lands between entirely under Marika's thumb, it was finally time to enact her revenge on the Hornsent. But why not deal with two problems at once? After all, it was the spiral of the Crucible that the Hornsent were chasing after when committing the genocide of her people. The Erdtree is the Crucible of Life, and so the order that the Golden Order covets would need to be extracted. And so that's what Marika did, manifesting an enormous sealing tree, the same type of tree used to veil Enir Ilim in shadow, and grafted the Erdtree to its trunk, stealing the capital O order from within it to be preserved. In one fell swoop, the chaotic nature of the Crucible as well as her persecutors were effectively removed from the lands between. After all, the remembrance of the Shadow Sunflower says that the Scadutree was born out of dark notions that bear no semblance of order. Of course, this is my theory based on informed speculation, but I believe it stitches together the clues rather well. It is stated outright, as well as informed by environmental clues, that the Crucible is stronger in the Land of Shadow. Because of this, aspects of the Primordial Crucible appear everywhere, especially in the animals and even more so in the ruins of Rau, which I talked about at length in this video. It follows that in the age before the Erdtree, these aspects flourished across the lands between, but since the veiling of the Land of Shadow, its power has been concentrated here. This concentration perfectly aligns with the theory that the Erdtree / Primordial Crucible was sealed away. And as for why Rau is so potent with crucible energy, it, along with the hinterlands, are the only regions of the Land of Shadow that were untouched by the Burning Crusade. There is more to it than that, but I'm saving it for a part 2. Yes, there will be a part 2. One more point to this topic, the Crucible is said to be gold, tinged with red. The sap dripping from the linear trunk of the Scadutree is indeed gold, with a red tinge. The aforementioned shift from the Erdtree becoming a tree that granted blessings to an object of faith, marked by the change in the Erdtree sigils, is something that I believed happened right around this time, as I had discussed earlier a couple times. And finally, the quote, "The Scadutree is the shadow of the Erdtree," makes sense, as it's the Jungian shadow to the Erdtree's persona. Quick analytical psychology lesson: the persona is the public image of one's personality, which derives from the ego ideal, which in turn is the inner image of oneself as one wants to become. Contrasting the persona is the shadow, an unconscious aspect of the personality that does not correspond with the ego ideal, creating conflict with it. Carl Jung argued that the assimilation of the shadow by the ego can lead to a sort of mental enlightenment, but that repression of the shadow will cause it to lash out or express itself in ways that conflict with the persona. This is a pretty concise summary of the conflict between the Erdtree and the Primordial Crucible before the Land of Shadow was hidden. So, at this time, all of the undesirable, conflicting aspects that were repressed by the Golden Order had been filtered and left to rot behind Marika's veil. With the persona of the Erdtree extracted, the shadow is left behind. The Scadutree is the shadow of the Erdtree, and the Erdtree in Leyndell became merely an object of faith. It might seem strange to talk about the Erdtree from a psychoanalytical point of view, since it is a tree after all, but we already discussed that it manifests as avatars to protect itself and its offspring, and we haven't even talked about the Impenetrable Thorns. Throughout Elden Ring, thorns represent punishment, agony, and despair. We have Elemer of the Briar, his armor covered in thorns, indicating that he has a death sentence over his head. There are the Thorn Sorcerers, who naturally cast Thorn Sorceries, which describe them as exiled criminals. Using these sorceries entails wounding yourself to conjure the briars from your agony, and the sorcerers themselves have had their eyes gouged out by a crown of thorns. The hood of the guilty is adorned with a crown of thorns, and thankfully, these don't gouge our own eyes out as well. And then there are the Impenetrable Thorns that prevent us from accessing the Erdtree's inner sanctum, which were a bit of a mystery before the DLC came out. Well, the Impenetrable Thorns have made another appearance in Shadow of the Erdtree, several in fact. We are first likely to encounter the thorns that are covering the doorway from Belurot to Enir Ilim, just after the fight with the Dancing Lion. These are connected to the Sealing Tree, and for an awesome watch, I recommend Benun's video detailing her theory regarding the Sealing Tree. The next two are new sorceries found within Shadow Keep, named Impenetrable Thorns and Mantle of Thorns. These are both described as being sorceries of those whose faith rewarded them only with despair, in that the user wounds themselves with thorns grown from the Scadutree. The last instance of Impenetrable Thorns is in the fight with the Scadutree avatar itself, where it uses the thorns liberally during most of its attacks, further cementing the fact that these blackened briars originate with the Scadutree. Why is this symbol of despair and agony so closely associated with it? I think here we must differentiate between the standard red-colored thorn sorceries and the black impenetrable thorn sorceries. Both entail agony, suffering, and despair, but the red ones are also indicative of a punishment or guilt. An external force is causing this suffering, and this is reinforced by Elberic's set, which is embedded with glintstones formed from the blood of sacrifices, and it only enhances these red thorn sorceries. The thorn sorceries of the Scadutree stem from an internal anguish, a feeling of despair and abandonment. Well, the Scadutree was abandoned and betrayed. The original trunk of the Erdtree, which was created by Marika, was thrown away despite all the blessings that it once bestowed. This is likely why the Scadutree helped Miquella break his great rune. It is a victim like everything else in the Land of Shadow. The music during the Scadutree Avatar's boss fight begins with an intense combat track, but it transitions to a much more melancholic, somber piece as the fight goes on. The Scadutree must hate Marika for what she did, and now her champion has come to do it harm once again, and it's losing the battle. The despair felt by the Shadowtree's avatar is palpable. The Mantle of Thorns item description reads, "The image of the misshapen Scadutree is an edict. Spurn all that exists, wound all that exists, for we have been abandoned."